am so delighted to be with you today. It is wonderful to have the opportunity to think about and talk with you around what it means to be in this moment of the pandemic, and to think about what it means for us to be able to find a sense of resilience, to find a space of hope and spiritual care for this. I'm going to invite us to sit for a moment in silence. And what I'd like you to be able to do in this moment is to find a comfortable setting for yourself. If you are in a chair, I invite you to sit back. Don't lean all the way into your chair. Allow your spine to support itself. Sit up straight. Imagine there's a string that is from your belly button and it goes all the way up through your spine and out the top of your head. And I want you to imagine you're gently pulling on that string and letting it go so that your posture is upright but relaxed. Your shoulders are relaxed. Relax your shoulders more. You always think you relax your shoulders, but you don't. There's still tension there. And then I'm going to invite you in this space to take 3 deep breaths. And we're going to do that together in a minute, but not yet. The way that I'm going to ask you to take those breaths is to breathe in deeply through your nose. Pay attention to the feeling of the air as it goes in, the sound of it. And as that air comes in, I want you to put your hand on your belly and expand your belly so that you're breathing through your diaphragm. And then you're going to slowly, very slowly let that breath out through your mouth. Okay? All right. So here we go. I invite you to take that deep breath in. Expanding, expanding. And then slowly, slowly let it out through your mouth. And then again, as you come to rest, take another deep breath in. And then slowly, slowly let it out through your mouth. Again, coming back to rest. And one last time, taking that deep breath in. And slowly, slowly, ever so slowly letting it out until you come at rest. I tell students that 3 deep breaths can solve any problem that you have in the moment. And so whenever you're feeling stressed or unable to focus, if you take those 3 deep breaths, it taps into your parasympathetic nervous system and it gives you just a little moment of calm. It's a tool that you can take wherever you are. So from this space of calm, we're going to talk a little bit today about COVID fatigue. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happening. Why are we experiencing this? We're going to look at a theory that helps explain why we're kind of unable or what happens when we have so much stress. It's one theory among many, but we're going to talk about that theory. And that's what we're going to spend the first part talking about. And then the second part, we're going to look at ways in which we can use that theory to think about concrete practices in our own life, particularly spiritual practices, that can help us to manage that stress. Okay? So, deep breath when we go to the next slide. COVID. It was at this time exactly last year that conversations around the university and around the country began to happen around what we were going to do, how we were going to respond to this emerging and unfolding pandemic. We had begun to do good hand hygiene. We were learning at this time last year how to wash our hands for 20 seconds and sing happy birthday in the mirror. We were beginning to think about social distancing, though we hadn't yet done it. And in just a few weeks here in California on March 15th is when we went into shelter in place. For many of us, COVID has created a sense of isolation. Social distancing has not just meant that we're 6 feet apart, but that we feel worlds apart, connecting only over Zoom screens or out windows or through glass doors. For some of us, it has meant that we are now having to manage all sorts of things. We're having to work full time while our children are in the background. My children are in the background there. They've been told to be quiet for this hour, but they're at school, right? And so here we are working full time, managing everything that we would do and managing our children at school as well, all sorts of things. And so it leads to a lot of stress, trying to just figure out how to balance this new normal, which we thought maybe back in March was going to be a few months. And now we're coming on a year, and we know that it will not end in the year. We know that as the vaccine takes time to take hold in the country, it's going to be several more months. We're not going to return to normal anytime soon. That's the first level of the pandemic. The second level of the pandemic has been this unveiling of racial injustice in our country. If we think about the ways in which Asian and Asian Americans have been targeted in our country, continue to be here in the Bay Area. There have been recent rises in attacks of hate crimes against Asian and Asian American people on the streets. The ways in which we saw, particularly over the summer, but throughout the time, the ways in which anti-Black racism has been revealed. It has existed all along, but now with the pandemic, we're looking at these disparities. There's significant disparities in health, there's significant disparities in vaccine distribution and access. And so all of these things have led to an increase of stress, an increase of tension. We know here at the university for students have been impacted in a significant way. Student well-being during COVID has been negatively impacted. No matter all of the resources that we have and that we do to support students, we know nationally students are experiencing an incredible level of stress. A recent study that was done by Active Minds showed that 91% of college students reported that COVID-19 has caused them stress or anxiety. 81% said it brought disappointment or sadness, and 80% said that they were experiencing loneliness. And we know it is not students alone. It's all of us who've experienced this. The US Census Bureau and the National Center for Health and Statistics has showed that more than 4 in 10 adults have developed symptoms of depression or anxiety by the end of 2020. And if you look at that kind of bar chart there, you'll see the increase over time in those adults who have indicated that they are experiencing anxiety, depression, or depression. And you can see that in 2019, it was, hovering between 8 and 12%. And now, at the end of December, when they did this December 2020, it was hovering between 37 and 42%. It's an incredible increase in stress. And those of you who came today, you came because you probably also are experiencing that type of stress. We know that, again, just as we think about the disparities in the COVID, the ways in which COVID has impacted our health outcomes, there's disparities in the way it has impacted our mental health. So we know that the number, for example, young people, the number of people seeking support has increased 90%. And young people, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native Americans experience significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation during COVID. We also know that the rate of suicidal ideation particularly is highest among queer youth. And that part of the difficulty in all of this is this sense of isolation and loneliness. So as we talk about young people, 70% say that loneliness is part of what's increasing this increase in anxiety and depression. Before COVID, I think you could say that we were experiencing a mental health crisis in higher ed and in the country. And I think now we're experiencing a mental health tsunami, a mental health catastrophe. Now, in normal times, outside of pandemic, in a healthy, kind of a healthy mental health situation, we all have what Dan Siegel has talked about as a window of tolerance. So you see on the screen, there's these 2 lines with these green arrows, and you can think about it as a box, right? So in normal times, we all have this ability to manage stress. And so as life's ups and downs happen in this box, we can roll with the punches. We can, oftentimes people talk about it as sailing a sea, right? Like we're able to sail with ups and downs of life, and it's okay. Now here's the problem. When we experience stress or trauma. And I'm going to show you a slide that has an example of a kind of trauma, but really it's also stress. And particularly in the pandemic, we think about chronic stress, which has caused COVID fatigue. When we experience this trauma or stress, what happens to this healthy, normal container or window of tolerance that we have that can control stress? It compresses. So when life's ups and downs normally could do that, when you compress it, right, the ups and downs begin to go outside of our window of tolerance. And so kind of in psychological terms, you can think about it as either hyper, like above, or hypo arousal, right? So either we become really agitated, we experience anxiety, hyperactivity, hypervigilance, we can't kind of sit still. I don't know if folks have experienced that as part of your COVID fatigue. The other side of it is that you can have hypoarousal, which means that you experience like chronic fatigue or symptoms of depression where it's very hard to get going. It's lethargy. You have a flat affect, right? Both of those are completely normal responses to a compression of a window of tolerance. And the difficulty with COVID fatigue is what has happened is that we have had chronic stress. So our windows of tolerance have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller throughout the pandemic. I want you to think for just a moment, and I want you to put it in the chat so that we can kind of conjure this experience for all of us. But what have been the pressure points for you that you feel like the stress has compressed your window? What are the things that have caused you stress during the pandemic? Losing your grandmother, losing loved ones, right? Grief is always hard. In a pandemic, the chaos at the hospital for healthcare workers, it's just been incessant. Not being able to visit family at home, kids home all the time, getting hospitalized, having family there. Sometimes family go to the hospital and you can't see them. Teaching on Zoom, unable to be with our friends, right? Unable to support loved ones, screen fatigue, losing contact, right? Like, oh my goodness, right? Like it is just compressing and compressing and compressing. And the difficulty with the pandemic is that it's very hard for us to see an end. We say here at Stanford, when we say like, well, what's the future? We all say like, oh, we have cloudy crystal balls. It's a lovely way of saying that we're in this period of kind of chronic uncertainty, right? An unending uncertainty. All of these things. But here's the good news. That window of tolerance, actually, we all hold the capacity within ourselves to open that back up, even under periods of chronic stress. And that's what I want to talk about today, this capacity that we have, right? Even in the midst of all of the things that we're talking about in the chat, all of that stress, right? We can open that window, right? And some of you, I imagine, have been already doing that. You have found ways to open your own window, to find moments of self-care, to find ways to find a moment of calm or manage that. So I'm going to invite you in this moment, after having conjured this sense of like what the stress was like. I mean, the chat is just keep going, right? And I want you to take a moment. I want you to think about when you felt calm in the past year. What have you been doing? How did you find that moment? And I think for all of us, it's really fleeting, right? But when you have experienced calm, what were you doing? You were listening to music. You got married, you celebrated, right? We shifted, we changed how we were doing. Walking, hiking, being at the beach, being among the redwoods, right? Paying attention, singing, cooking, exercising, right? Isolation, right? Being alone, taking time for introspection, napping, right? Yoga, gardening, like all of these things, right? These are practices that when we're doing them, we are naturally kind of intuitively spreading that window back open, whether or not we have had access to this theory or not. We have known in some way what it has been like to pry open that window so that we can breathe again, right? So Dan Siegel, who coined the term window of tolerance and helped us think about this theory, he talked about this power of awareness that can change our well-being. And the practices that he talks about cultivating really are rooted and based in an understanding of mindfulness. So the first thing that we do is we learn to be aware by paying attention to the present moment. Mindfulness can help re-regulate our central nervous system, right? So this idea that our sympathetic, kind of the part of the nervous system that excites us, and the parasympathetic, the part that grounds us, it gets out of whack when our windows of tolerance are compressed. And so what mindfulness can do is to help ground us and re-regulate our nervous system so that we can manage and sail more calmly, open those windows of life stress, right? So this idea that mindfulness, that you have a mindfulness gauge, the first thing is to notice how you're feeling. Are you hyper excited? Are you hypo? Are you feeling depressed and fatigued, right? Notice where your window is. And then there are practices like mindful meditation, grounding exercises, slow breathing, like we did at the very beginning. All of these are tools for prying open, for expanding, for giving us space to breathe in that window of tolerance, right? So when we talk about mindfulness, what are we actually talking about, right? I love this cartoon, right? Because our minds are always full. And mindfulness is actually not about emptying them, right? It's about paying attention to the present moment, right? It's not about getting rid of everything. We wouldn't be human if we didn't think about those things. Those are always going to be there. But it's learning to focus just on the present in just one moment. Jon Kabat-Zinn, so the work of Dan Siegel has been mostly around questions around trauma and around childcare and around thinking about this dysregulation, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems and how mindfulness does that. So you can think about Dan Siegel in that way. Jon Kabat-Zinn was not looking at trauma so much as chronic pain. And he was trying to find a way to relieve chronic pain in his patients, and mindfulness became the primary way for him to do that. And so, Jon Kabat-Zinn, this definition has really become central in the way that we think about it, this awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. Now, I don't know how many of you, if you want to put in the chat, how many of you have done mindfulness meditation or meditation in some way? Just kind of put a +1 if you've done that so that we can see, yeah, right? Many people, yoga is a form of it, right? Meditation daily, right? These are things that we do, right? And we learn. And the thing about meditation, Dan Harris, who does 10% Happier, what he says is that we don't do meditation because we get because we have to. We end up doing it because we learn that we feel better after we do it, right? And so once you begin to do it, you reap the rewards of what that's like for you. Yeah. So there's been a lot of information, a lot of studies around the benefits of mindfulness. Somebody mentioned in the chat, full catastrophe living. Absolutely. If you go to the back of that, you'll see the catalog of all of the research that looks at the benefits of mindfulness. They're huge, right? Stress reduction, boosts memory, increases focus, less emotional reactivity, right? It calms the amygdala, the kind of reptilian part of our brain that tells us that we've either got to fight or flee, right? It decreases rumination. So somebody said like worry all the time, right? It helps to calm that down. It gives us cognitive flexibility. We get better relationships. We're able to see kind of in our own life better. Improved immune function, right? Like there's this real psychosomatic connection. We can increase our processing speed, right? Students really like that when I tell them that. They're like, oh, excellent. It also increases GPA, which is the #1 reason I think any student starts to meditate after they take a class with me. But it also increases our efficiency, and overall it increases and improves our well-being, right? All of these things that folks are putting in the chat, please, this is the data. But again, I use data with students because they need to know that this is real, right? But really, we do it because when we do it consistently, it makes us feel better, right? In the end. Sarah Lazar's work at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, again, this is the part that students are always like, excellent, sign me up for this, shows that actually long-term meditators, or even in long-term, the study was just really a series of weeks. It wasn't like for years and years and years. But if you meditate consistently over time, you actually increase the gray matter in your frontal cortex. And so students are always like, are you saying that I can like increase my brain and grow my brain? And the answer is yes, data has showed that meditation actually increases gray matter. And I really encourage you to look at Sarah Lazar's work. It is really great. This slide here, I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is for students, particularly students who are studying neuroscience, this is what they want to know, right? Like exactly what's happening in my brain. The study that she did was really only 8 weeks. So it showed improvement in 8 weeks with an average of 27 minutes a day. So again, like you don't have to become His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You don't need to meditate all day long. You just need to have a regular practice. Now, when we think of mindfulness meditation, we think primarily of a white Western interpretation where mindfulness has become part of a data, right? Like I've just given you all of these studies where we have looked at it as a mechanism, a psychosomatic mechanism in order to calm or either to alleviate chronic pain or to alleviate stress or to heal from trauma. But the insights or the actual practices of mindfulness are actually rooted in traditions. And the mindfulness meditation that we know that from Jon Kabat-Zinn and Dan Siegel originates from a Buddhist practice, right? We think about mindfulness as part of that eightfold path. Sati is the word that is used in Buddhism. But I want us to be, mindful or careful that the way that kind of Western white medical culture has developed mindfulness is actually distinct and different from the Buddhist practice. They overlap, they work in the same way in some sense, but actually sati in a Buddhist context is different. It's similar, but it's different than the way in which it has been taken up in our own understanding of mindfulness. And so as we think about these things, it's really, really important that we're not appropriating from religious traditions, that we're honoring, we're recognizing, we're seeing where the difference is. But the reality is that, religions have been doing this for years. I want to recommend to you a book. It's by Shensing Han, who is a Stanford alum and a Buddhist chaplain. And she has just released a book called Be the Refuge, Raising Voices of Asian American Buddhists. And in that book, she talks about this differences in the ways in which Buddhism has been both popularized and appropriated in our culture today, and the ways in which it doesn't have to be either or, how Asian American Buddhists are managing that today. And so I really, really recommend that book to you. But here's the thing, right? Spiritual and religious traditions have been doing this type of work for a really, really long time. Traditions all across the spectrum, whether they're Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or Muslim or Jewish, we have these practices. Someone wrote contemplative prayer, right? Cynthia Bourgeault has been the person who's popularized that idea of contemplative prayer. Again, it's rooted in this concept of paying attention, of being in the moment, right? So when I talk about spiritual and contemplative practices, what I'm talking about is this idea of spirituality. It can be part of a religious tradition. So many people are part of organized religious traditions, historic, ancient traditions, but it can also simply mean how we make meaning in our lives. So many people will say to me like, oh, I'm not religious, or I'm spiritual but not religious, or, I don't really do religion, spiritual practices aren't for me. And, that's fine. But what I want to offer is that actually all of us all the time are engaging in meaning making and trying to make sense out of the present moment. And that practice of trying to make sense of who we are and who we seek to become and how do we make sense of what's happening in the world, that idea, that understanding of like what our values and beliefs are, that can be thought of as spirituality. And the practices that help us to make meaning and make sense, right? Those are spiritual practices. Now, what I want to talk a little bit about is the work of Carrie Doering. Carrie Doering is a professor at Iliff School of Theology, and she looks at pastoral psychology. She wrote an article after the death of her son that looked at how spiritual practices helped her to heal and to grieve after that great loss. The portion of the slide that you see on your left-hand side is a portion of the sermon that her pastor gave at her son's memorial, and how healing that was for her. And what she talks about is that the grief and the trauma and the stress that we experience in life can be healed and can be, healing is not like an end point. Like, so I don't want to, like when I say healing, I think of it as a process and it's ongoing. We can learn to hold the grief and the trauma and the stress through spiritual practices. And what she talks about is, what are the types of spiritual practices that do that? She talks about them being embodied spiritual practices. So they're practices that are body aware. So again, if you think about mindfulness, it's about being mindful of the breath. It's about being mindful of the senses. It's about being mindful, right? So it has to do with the body, right? So these spiritual practices are body aware. Think about in your own religious traditions. You can write these in the chat, whether it's a religious or spiritual traditions. What are the things that you do or the practices in your faith that are body aware, that have to do with bodies, right? In my own tradition, I'm Christian, we take communion. It's about being fed, right? That's a very bodily practice. We sing, we use our lungs, right? You can go ahead and write in the chat those things, playing the piano, those things that are part of your own spiritual traditions that have to do with the body, walking the labyrinth, yeah. The practices also need to be intrinsically meaningful. That means just doing the practice in and of itself has to have meaning, right? So it's not just doing something that is, that gets you grounded in your body, but the practice itself in and of itself, whether or not it's attached to your stress or your trauma or whatever, that actually that practice has meaning, and that you're doing it intentionally, right? You're not just doing it by accident, right? Running, taking walks, yoga, all of these things are practices. And that's what opens the window, right? What opens the window are these practices. I want us to listen just for a moment. We're not going to listen. We're not going to be able to listen to the whole thing. But this is the song. This is the song that got Carrie through that death. The video is Dan Forrest, Good Night, Dear Heart. And it's a university choir that is singing it. But if you just Google Dan Forrest, Good Night, Dear Heart, you will find that piece, and I encourage you to listen to it. But that was the music, and part of it was that choral music for Carrie had been something in her whole life that she had used. It had been a spiritual practice that was bodily. She's a singer. It had intrinsic meaning, and it was intentional when she listened to it. And so she talks about in this article the ways in which spirituality can be a resource for resilience. It can generate an experience of benevolence, right? I think also if you listen to that whole song, it is comforting and calming. And so when you engage in these spiritual practices, they can create this sense of well-being, this sense of benevolence. Spiritual practices, when you do them over time, also give you flexibility in coping and flexibility in seeking meaning, right? They help you to construct new meaning, right? Why do bad things happen? In some ways, religions have been answering that primary question since the beginning of time, right? Spiritual practices help you to find grounded, life-giving, spiritual meanings for what's making sense. And sometimes it means that there is no reason. And that's also a spiritual answer, a theological answer to this question of theodicy or why is this happening to us? And what spiritual practices do over time, and again, we see this particularly in the way mindfulness meditation works, is that they integrate, they create a sense of integration. So when you think about trauma, part of the healing of trauma is being able to integrate that experience into who you are. And that's what spiritual practices do over time. They help us to make sense out of the world. The Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education has created, and there's also the Association for Contemplative Mind and Society as well, they're linked together. They've created this tree of contemplative practices. And what they're trying to do is to show the various ways in which spiritual practices are all kind of doing the same thing. So in the popular imagination, mindfulness meditation is it. That's the only thing that you can do to de-stress. And for some people, that just does not work. That is not the way that they are able to widen their window, right? But there are a million different ways that we can learn how to pay attention to the present moment. There are these different categories like stillness, right? Ways of being quiet. There are generative ways of creating meaning, right? There are rituals, right? We're going to be doing a ritual at Stanford University on March 15th to mark the 1-year anniversary of shelter in place, because we know that's going to be a difficult day on our campus for people who remember kind of the trauma of being told we couldn't come back to campus. So we'll be doing a ritual to help people move through that. Some of it is movement. A lot of folks have been talking about labyrinths and walking in nature. Nature itself is a contemplative practice. There's been a study about nature bathing and the ways in which nature bathing can actually also widen that window of tolerance, right? So there's all of these different ways, and in different traditions over time, these practices show up, right? In scripture, in contemplative, looking at icons, kind of gazing at icons is another contemplative practice that comes out of different traditions. This is our labyrinth here at Stanford. Music, right? Qawwali music, dancing from our powwow here at Stanford, also from Diwali, right? Art, all of these are sacred practices, religious practices that ground us, pilgrimages, right? Ways in which we use our spiritual traditions to widen our windows of tolerance, right? And we know from the data around mindfulness meditation that these spiritual practices that Carrie Doering was talking about, these embodied spiritual practices, work in very similar ways, right? They're all doing the same thing, but they're doing it in different avenues. And we know that that kind of sense of widening the window when you're working with folks around how do they do that, everybody has a different skill set, there's a different thing that resonates that opens their space. Here at Stanford, we are so fortunate to have the Windover Contemplative Center. We do yoga and meditation there. You can also just come in and contemplate the beautiful works of Nathan Oliveira, right? We have an interfaith center where we bring students together to share insights from their own religious and non-religious traditions. And at the very center of campus at Stanford, because of the intentional vision of Jane and Leland, there is Memorial Church. And they set it there intentionally as a non-sectarian space. Now, when we're talking about what interfaith looked like at the founding of the university, vastly different. And so people may say, well, it doesn't look very interfaith because Jesus is on every space. That is true. But did you know at the inauguration, at the opening, that Jane Stanford invited both a rabbi and a Catholic priest? Because again, like back in that time period, Protestants and Catholics were not considered of the same faith tradition, though today we would say they both share Christianity. Right? But at that time period, this was what interfaith or multi-faith or non-sectarian looked like. And Jane, the architect, had said, like, let's why don't we put the library at the center of campus? And Jane said, no, we are not doing that. We are putting the chapel, we are putting Memorial Church at the very center of campus because we believe that an education ought to educate not just the head, but also the heart. And it ought to be a sense of formation of a good person for the sake of humanity. And the way that we do that, and the way that she thought about doing that, was through these spiritual practices. And again, the vision at the time period was not as inclusive as we think about it now. But all of our spiritual practices, all of these traditions, this tree of contemplative practices, they're all really about helping us to become wider and hold more capacity for this stress, right? And so as you think about your own spiritual practices and think about the new ones that you might want to develop as you encounter new stressors through this prolonged period of multiple pandemics, think about them. What are the bodily aware, intrinsically meaningful and intentional practices that arise out of religious traditions or out of your own practice that you intuitively know calm you down? And then think about how you can be more intentional and more regular in those practices. Spirituality is a great, great resource for us. And we just have to learn how to tap into it. So I want to turn it back to Emily now for a time of question and answer. I am going to stop share and we will come back together.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. That was really wonderful. We have a question here that says, do you have a recommendation on mindfulness and meditation practices? The concern is that whether listening to apps like Calm or Headspace have the same benefits versus meditating on your own or with an actual guide.
Yeah, so first thing I would say is whatever kind of meditation you can do, do it, right? So if it is Headspace or Calm, that's better than not doing it, right? And for a lot of people, this idea that they're going to sit down for 20 minutes a day, one, where do you find 20 minutes a day, first of all? And two, it is really scary to think about what my head is going to say when I sit down by myself and like what's going to happen. So the first thing I will say is that however you can do it, do it. Even if it's a minute. How many people have Apple Watches? Just write on your like +1 if you have an Apple Watch, right? I shouldn't be pubbing particular brands or health, any type of watch, but the Apple Watch will remind you to breathe, and it's just in minute intervals, right? So even a minute, even what I say to students, even 3 minutes, 3 deep breaths, right, will help calm you, right? So the research shows that the mindfulness meditation that works is about 20 to 30 minutes daily over a period of 8 weeks. That's how you're going to grow your brain. But if you can take 1 minute at any moment in your day to breathe, to take 3 deep breaths, that's going to be great too. And the recommendation that I would have for you is to try multiple ways, right? So figure out what works for you. And I'll say for myself, like what works for me in a certain season of my life doesn't work in another. And so I have to be really flexible in how I do meditation, whether it's contemplative prayer or labyrinth walking. For me, it really shifts and changes over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just adding on to that, there's a question about if you could speak a little bit more about what is Labyrinth Movement?
Yeah, so a lot of people talk about the Labyrinth Movement. Here in the Bay Area, we think about it generating from Grace Cathedral and the work of the Labyrinth Project there. So in Grace Cathedral during the AIDS epidemic, the crisis that was here, Grace Cathedral was trying to figure out how they can respond to this great crisis. And one of the priests there went to Chartres and rediscovered the labyrinth. And so beginning in the 1980s and 90s, you see this increase of labyrinths happening all over. And the genesis of it came from the work of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, and then it really started spreading. But it is not a new practice. It's actually an ancient practice. We think of it most directly through Christian cathedrals during the medieval period. We think of it at Chartres, but actually there are labyrinths in India, New Zealand, and the American Southwest. It's a way of using, a labyrinth is just simply a pattern. There's lots of different patterns, and it's one path. It's unicursal, so it's one path. So you follow the path that gets you in, and you have to take the same path out. And so the idea of walking a labyrinth is that when you are walking into the labyrinth, you are thinking or focusing on the question that you have. This is a very simple way of thinking about it, but it's about a release, right? So the walking in is the release of all the things. In the center of the labyrinth, you're opening yourself up to receive wisdom, insight, whether from yourself or the divine. And then when you're walking back out of the path, it's a return. So return back to the world, right? Because you have to be able to integrate what you've received and learned into it. So the Labyrinth Movement is basically a way to talk about this movement that starts in the 80s and onward. But it has been really great. We are hoping to do a series of pop-up labyrinths on campus. We've been trying to do this for a while, but a pop-up labyrinth is a labyrinth that would be made out of whatever materials are around, and it would show up for a time period and then it would leave. And so builds curiosity.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So another question is, do you have any tips for people who are living in urban settings and missing campus and the weather and outdoors of Palo Alto, what they might be able to do to connect with them?
Yeah, I think the city is actually filled with opportunities to pay attention and to be mindful. And so there is something about, you know, this idea that really mindfulness happens in the natural open expanses where it's quieter, like when you get to the top of the dish and no one else is there and you're able to see all of campus and how beautiful it is, or if you sit beneath the palm trees. And that is true, and it is really lovely. But there is beauty and grace everywhere we go. And so my advice to folks in urban areas is there's twofold. So there's two different things that you could do. One is where to get outside, right? Like even in cities, there's outside space. So please go outside, take walks, right? And on your walk, pay attention to what you see. One of the ridiculous habits that I have, and if you ever see me walking across campus, you'll be like, who is that woman who is out of her mind? Like, what is she doing? When I see something, a practice for me to help me to be mindful about it is that I greet it, right? So it happened to me, it was a long time ago when I was struck one night by the beauty of the moon. I was just struck by the beauty of the moon. And so I stopped and I just said, thank you, moon, right? It seems really silly, but what it does is it stops me in my path and it makes me appreciate it. So now sometimes like a squirrel will run across, I'll be like, hello, squirrel, right? And again, it seems totally ridiculous, right? But it helps me to do that. And I don't do it all the time, right? But it is a way. So when you're walking in the city, pay attention. And whether you greet it like I do, like, hello, rat and trash can, like whatever it is that you're noticing, to take notice. The other thing that you can do in cities is all cities have open space, right? It's hard to find, but there are parks, even corners, squares where you can find a little bit of an open space. And what I encourage you to do is to develop a practice which is called a sit spot. So go to that space every day at the same time. Now, some people are like, I can't get outside. Okay, so go to your window at the same time every day, right? And spend 10, 20 minutes noticing. And what you'll see is their patterns. And in that noticing, right, you'll develop that sense of mindfulness. It's everywhere. Beauty is absolutely everywhere. You can connect to that wherever you are. Even if it's in your room in front of the Zoom screen, turn it off, take 3 deep breaths, and then come back to the Zoom screen.
Thank you. That made me think of another question that is how to introduce this meditation and mindfulness to children. Really advice for encouraging teenage boys who may not want to be hearing it from their yogi mom.
Yeah, so one thing I would say is Dan Siegel's work around parenting. Dan Siegel has a book particularly on teenagers. His book on there's lots of parenting that he does, and the root of it is all around this mindfulness practice, this practice of emotional regulation. So I would really encourage the work of Dan Siegel to you and those books. I actually just bought a whole bunch. I have a budding teenager and I need some more resources. But I would say start it early, right? And do it together, right? I have 2 young boys, 9 and 11. And my 11-year-old, we had a book. There's a lot of books around in introducing mindfulness and meditation to children, and mostly it's through stories and through these guided meditations. My son did not like that. He was just resistant to it. And so we do micro practices, and the micro practices we do with our children is we do deep breathing. So when something's really upsetting, we do belly breaths, right? The other thing that we do is we hike every weekend. They hate it. So they will say to me like, oh, I don't want to go on a hike, right? But the minute they have to drop into the space. So for the first half hour of the hike, and they're kind of tweenish, right? The first half hour, they hate it and they're complaining. And about a half hour in, no matter where we are, they drop into the space and they start noticing bugs and trees and sounds and smells. And it's really great. So the name of the author for mindfulness for kids, the story book that I was talking about is called Starlight, I think. If you just Google like Starlight meditation stories, you'll find it. That was a long time ago, and I have actually passed that book on to other folks, so I don't remember the title of that. But the person who's done the research around it is Dan Siegel, and Mindsight is his website. There's a lot of resources that you can pay for there, but I just really think about his books that are where I have learned about that. Beholding and contemplative reading are also practices I used to work at Wellesley College, and we had an art institute there, and we would take students to the different installations and have them behold paintings as a form of contemplation. Students loved that. I think one of the things about all of these practices that is really important is that even though we think about them as, people do them alone or do them individually, you actually can't hold a contemplative or meditative practice without community. And so, the first community that we have is our family, right? So I do this with my children, and that's the community that we do, and it holds us together. When I was doing mindfulness meditation, actually for me to hold my practice, this is horrible. I actually have to be the leader so that I feel like a responsibility for showing up, and we do it together. So that is actually a good practice for me. Another thing that people can do to help them, you might say, well, like I don't have a community, or I'm not part of a religious tradition. I don't go to synagogue. I'm not part of a masjid. I'm spiritual, but not religious. One of the things that you can do is find a spiritual director. There's actually an alum, Stephen Crandall. I think he's on here. So Stephen, if you're on here, shout out in the chat, is part of Spiritual Directors International. And so you can go to Spiritual Directors International and find a spiritual director who will accompany you in your own spiritual practice, and to create a sense of community, right? It's a really great practice. I've had spiritual directors throughout my life, and they have been a grounding. And what a good spiritual director does is they give you homework, right? Which is probably why, as a higher ed professional, I really like it. I'm like, all right, what do I have to do next, right? Tell me what to do, right? Because sometimes we don't know what to do. And sometimes it's really scary to go into those spaces alone. And sometimes we worry that we'll get there and we won't be able to get out. And so a spiritual director will accompany you. And that's what we do on campus for students. The Office for Religious and Spiritual Life, we see ourselves as accompanying students, staff and faculty, through life, right? We help them to make sense, to figure out who they are and who they want to become for the sake of the world. We help them to think about their moral compass, right? And to hone it, and to leave Stanford, not just to do whatever it is that they were taught to do in class. But the mission of the university is that all of our education, in the end, must be for the sake of humanity, right? And if we're going to work for the sake of humanity, we have to be in touch with that, and we have to be grounded within ourselves. And we need a community to cultivate that. And so that's the work that we try to do here for students on campus.
Are there suggestions or special suggestions you have for escaping or removing oneself from worry and concern, anxiety about current events and news that just almost always seem to be so grim these days?
Yeah. So it does feel impossible to get away from it. And in reality, you're not ever really going to be able to get away from it, but you can limit it. Right. And that's absolutely really important. So probably most of you, like me, are on Zoom 8+ hours a day, right? You're staring at a screen. Turn off the screens. When you're done with your meetings, don't do anything screen related. Don't do social media. For some people, social media is calming, but really, like, actually, social media can be a drama in and of itself, right? So turn off your screens. At the end of the day, turn off your screens. My practice is I plug my phone in to be recharged, and I put it in an inaccessible spot in the house so that I'm not tempted to go turn it on or to look. Limit what type of news that you see, right? So think about where are your sources of news, and only check once a day, right? Limit yourself to doing that. And then I would say cultivate practices for finding good news. Thinking about, how do you balance that? John Krasinski early on in the pandemic I don't even know if it's still going on, but it was a lifesaver for me. Did like a Good News Network news show. Find those things, like figure out what it is. Social distancing doesn't have to mean social isolation. So again, a way to decrease your anxiety is to make connections. I was struck with the Super Bowl ads this year. The theme across all of those ads was connection. We are craving connection, and connection widens our window. I didn't put community in those practices, but actually community builds our capacity and widens our window. So, figure out what it is. Like, so depending on where you are and what tier, of regulations you're in your county or your state, you still can see or engage with people socially distanced and in appropriate ways. And so figure out ways to do that. Can you take a socially distanced walk, right? I like to give gifts to neighbors. So I drop gifts off at neighbors' doors, and then we have conversations, about that. So figure out, what to do. I see that the office in the 70s didn't include spirituality. You're right. We just added that title about, 9 months ago. We changed our name from the Office for Religious Life. Probably in the 70s, there was no Office for Religious Life. It was probably just Memorial Church. But we began with the work of Bob Gregg, who was the first dean who began to expand and to do multi-faith work. And then we just added the Office for Religious Life. On our website, you see we do have our websites, I'm just going to say, we are trying to do a lot, and we're trying to get information up as fast as we can. So it's a little jumbled, and it's kind of like a rabbit warren. It's not like a labyrinth, because a labyrinth, you would hit one path and you would go and you can't get lost on a labyrinth. Our website, you could get a little lost. So I'm just going to say that. But if you noodle around and you go to spiritual wellness, there's a site called Spiritual Resources. Last year, we did every single day, Monday through Friday for a while. And then weekly, we did a blog reflection from all of the chaplains. They're really good to go back and reread. So there's, a whole year's worth of reflections there. We also have links to our services and to sermons, to inspirational talks. And then we have some resources for dealing both with anti-Black racism and the current pandemic. So just noodle around. And if you can't find what you're looking for on our website, shoot me an email. I'm happy to connect you.
Is there any research about how those with underlying conditions, high risk for COVID complications, who have had to isolate more intensely, are doing psychologically and emotionally compared to the quote unquote average person? And are there any studies about how Americans are faring in comparison to those from other countries and cultures who may be less me oriented based on societal norms?
Yeah, those are great questions. I do know that there is research that looks at the disparity of the impact. So I talked a little bit about that early on, particularly looking at young people, looking at Black, Asian, Latinx, queer folk. We know that the mental health burden on those folks is actually greater, and that they're at greater risk. I don't know about the research around those with underlying conditions, but I will say that there has been a tremendous amount of research that has happened really quickly within the past year in order for us to figure out how to grapple with it. And I would say that research is going to have to continue, because like any trauma, when we come back, whether it's spring quarter or it's fall quarter, life is not going to be the same. And the harm that has happened over the past year is going to take time to resolve and to heal. And so I'm really encouraged by the rate of research and the ways in which people are taking seriously the mental health toll. And I think we probably even have to double down when we come back. Our students, I think primarily of our student well-being, but also our staff and faculty, it's really hard. I'll say, I don't know if this was your experience or not, but here at Stanford, we had an extra week for winter break. And so we had 3 weeks. And going up to that 3 weeks, everybody in their mind was like, this is it's going to refill me. I'm going to be restored. No more email. I don't know about you, but email is the bane of my existence. It causes me more stress than anything else. And so we had this expectation that 3 weeks away was going to solve everything. And in January, we were going to come back and life was going to be easier and everything was going to be super. And the problem happened is that 3 weeks was great. But when we came back, things were actually worse. We felt worse. And so that hope and expectation landed us further down. And so I am actually really worried about the fall. I'm really, really worried about the mental health of our campus. We're doing a lot of work to figure out how to prepare and to get in shape for that. But we're going to need a lot more research and a lot more work done.
Yeah. Someone wrote in that they struggle every day to move from mindful to mindful. And they think they've always been this way, a typical type A. And are there studies that show that some people based on genetics or personality are more able to be mindful than others?
That's a really good question. I don't know about studies that have looked at that, but what I will say is that if you ask anybody, even the person who's like, I am the best meditator in the world, even if you actually, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has talked about this, right? Um, we, no one can shut off the like talking voice in our head. The only way that talking voice stops is when we die. No joke. It's just about being human. So when you're meditating or when you're mindful, it's not that those thoughts don't come, it's that you notice them and you're able to let them go. So I often think about it as, imagine yourself sitting at the bottom of a river on a rock, and you're looking up at all of the things that are passing, across the river, all these logs that are going, right? And those logs are your thoughts, right? And the goal is to be able to notice them and to let them go and to be mindful. For me, breathing and sound actually helps me ground and helps me to do that. But for no meditator, is it a constant state that's uninterrupted? Those thoughts are always floating above. And the question is how do you anchor yourself? When you have gotten up and when you've floated down a log, like, oh, I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. I think I'm going to have eggplant from the Stanford catering. Stanford catering is really doing a great job these days. I can't even believe that. I mean, right? And then you're floating down a log, and then the goal is to hop down. And what we know from neuroscience is that actually the muscles that are growing the brain, right? When I say like, how does the gray matter grow? That muscle is not grown in the static moment. The muscle is grown when you notice and you go back, right? So you can think about every time you get distracted, it's actually, I mix metaphors all the time. It's actually like you're a repetition of lifting weights, right? So every time you notice, oh, I'm floating down the river, and you come back, that's a rep, right? You're teaching your mind how not to keep floating down the river, right? So you're coming back, you're going up and you're coming back all the time. And so, some people talk about it in Buddhism, you'll talk about it as monkey mind. We all have monkey mind. The question is how do we experience it, and are we able to kind of let it go in that moment? I think everybody has the capacity to do it. I think the forms, what works for one person doesn't work for another. So it might be that mindfulness meditation is not the right thing for you, but maybe walking is, or maybe art or journaling or singing, right? Those are all ways of paying attention in the present moment, intentionally, without judgment, right? That don't include sitting still and trying to manage your mind. You can manage your mind in all sorts of different ways. So I would encourage you to try out different ways. Look at that tree of contemplative practice, and just keep picking new ones until you find the one that works for you.
Dean Steinwert, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and helping us find ways we can better manage during these times, and from simple to outside the box that we maybe haven't thought of. It's been invaluable. We are really grateful for you and your time.